Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. William Gass's article, The Case of the Obliging Stranger, is in a certain way issuing some significant challenges to ethics or moral theories or moralities, however we want to call them. We could say principled approaches to saying what's right and what's wrong, what's good and bad. And he's going to begin by saying, okay, consider a case. Imagine I approach a stranger on the street and say to him, "If you please, sir, I desire to perform an experiment with your aid." The stranger is obliging. I lead him away in a dark place conveniently by. I strike his head with the broad of an axe and cart him home. I place him buttered and trussed in an ample electric oven. The thermostat reads 450 degrees Fahrenheit. Thereupon I go off to play poker with friends and forget all about the obliging stranger in the stove. When I return, I realize I have overbaked my specimen and the experiment, alas, is ruined. So we have an interesting case of something clearly bad, right? And he says we can say something has been done wrong or something wrong has been done. And he's throwing that out there. These are two different kinds of statements, and they sort of prefigure what is going on in the article. Something has been done wrong, which otherwise perhaps wouldn't have been wrong, but there's certain features of the situation that make it wrong, or it's actually something wrong as such. And then the question is, what do we do with this? And Gass is going to say, listen, any ethic, any moral theory that does not roundly condemn my action is vicious. So any moral theory where it's okay to take an obliging stranger, trick them, hit them over the head with an axe, put them into the oven, whether the experiment turns out well or not, is going to be a bad moral theory, right? So that's an interesting feature. And he says, it's also interesting that none is vicious for this reason, because it fails this particular case. And he says, no more convincing of any ethic could be given than showing it approved of my baking the obliging stranger. So this is setting out a kind of puzzle. What is it that we're actually doing with moral theories? What do we take ourselves to be doing? And he's going to talk about how it is that ethicists, people who are doing this in a professional capacity, making judgments about this, not just academics, but we could say other people in life who are entrusted with saying, this is right, this is wrong, how are they typically solving these sorts of problems? He says, well, there's two main approaches, and they're done by analogy to mathematics or geometry, and by other methods, the scientific approaches, empirical approaches. And later he's going to tie these in with rationalism and empiricism as well. So he talks about the intuitive or deductive approach, and he talks about the empirical or inductive approach. You got one way or the other. They both are going to have problems. Why? Well, he says that the difficulty for the deductive or mathematical method is discovering indubitable first principles that don't themselves rest on any inductive foundation and are still applicable to the complicated tissue of factors that make up moral behavior. So it's perfectly,
okay to say, well, here's our principles and we've reasoned these out. The trouble is when we try to apply them to life, unless we're going to falsify the experience that we're applying them to, we're going to run into some difficulties. And you notice he says indubitable principles. That doesn't just mean that we ourselves can't doubt them, can't be convinced of them. It means that other people shouldn't be able to doubt them either. And what we do see is that in the field of ethics, there is a lot of doubt. Did you get the right principles to start with? So that's going to be a problem. The empirical or inductive, he says, they lop off the normative branch altogether and make ethics a matter of expediency, taste, or conformity to the moral etiquette of the time. One is told what people do, not what they ought to do. And philosophers who still wish to know what people ought to do are told by some of the more uncompromising they can have no more help from empiricism and are asking a silly question. We find that, he says, philosophers, otherwise empiricists who admit moral ends lie beyond the reach of factual debate, turn to moral sentiment or some other bonum ex machina. So that is a joke based on deus ex machina at the end of a play. When you've got an irresolvable problem, you just have God come down and solve it. So, and God in a sort of mechanism on the stage. So bonum ex machina, you just say, well, this is the way it works. Maybe we appeal to sympathy or something. And he's saying, yeah, none of these really work that effectively, but that's what we do in ethics, typically. So he's going to say, questions that investigators return again and again without success are probably improperly framed. So he's going to say, well, what is the ethical question that we're always after? What is good or what is bad, conversely, right? What is right or what is wrong, conversely. And he says right off the bat, we're not looking for a catalog of things. We're not saying, give me all the cases where what somebody is doing is wrong. So the case of the obliging stranger is a case of a moral action, but heaping those up doesn't actually tell us what is wrong in a general sense. And then he's got some interesting observations about ethical questions that are a little bit too short, right? Big questions, he says, ought to be themselves big, but they never really are. They tend to grow big by becoming short, too short, in fact, to ever receive an answer. So that's an interesting side note there. Then he comes back to thinking about, well, what are we actually asking about? If we ask, well, what is good? We're asking something like this. What is good in the things that are good? So we're looking for some common property, but not just any common property. It's not, so to pause here for a moment, we can't just say, what are the things that connect being good together? What do they have in common? Well, they're all, a certain color, or they produce a certain feeling within us, or something like that. That's not quite enough. What is it in them, the good things, the things that we say are good, that actually makes them good? This is why he says what we're really asking about here is a kind of power, or we could say causality or capacity, whatever you want to substitute here. He uses the word power, and he says that's what we're really asking about. And he says it should be perfectly clear it's not the things themselves that he thinks are good or bad, but the qualities they possess, the relations they enter into, or the consequences they produce. Even an intuitionist, so that's a particular approach in ethics, who claims to perceive goodness directly perceives a property of things when he perceives goodness and not anything except incidentally. So how would we look at the case of the obliging stranger? The wrong done to the obliging stranger was not the act of cooking him, but something belonging to the act in some one of many possible ways. And if I'm the person doing something bad, it is not I who am evil, but something which I have that is, and which of course I may be adjudged wicked for having whatever it is that I have that's bad, right? As if I owned a vicious an unruly dog. And he says, that's not really going to work here. And he actually says something very interesting. I think so long as I looked on my own act in this way, I wronged the obliging stranger a second time. So he's been wronged by the case itself. That's clear. But I can also wrong him by looking at the case in the wrong way. Now, by contrast, what does the moralist or ethic professor or moral judgment maker actually do? He says they're looking for the ingredient that perfects or spoils the stew. They're asking for something. What is it that makes these things good? And he says you can't ask questions forever. Pretty soon you got to have some sort of principle. So what would those look like? Pleasure is sought for pleasure's sake. Okay, a hedonist approach. The principle of utility is susceptible of no demonstration. Utilitarianism. Every act and inquiry aims at well-being, an Aristotelian approach. The non-natural property of goodness fastens itself to its object and will remain there whatever world the present world may madly become. It sounds like an intuitionist approach, similar to what G. Moore offered. Then finally, frustrated desires will give rise to problems, and problems are bad. Okay, I'm not sure which one that's supposed to be, but you could associate that with certain ethics. And then finally, we confer the title of the good upon our natural necessities. And a bit later on, he's going to, use these to say, think about it this way. What's wrong with the act of deceiving and killing and cooking the obliging stranger? My act produced more pain than pleasure. Or baking this fellow did not serve the greatest good to the greatest number. I acted wrongly because I could not consistently will that the maxim of my action become a universal law. That's Immanuel Kant's first formulation of the categorical imperative. God forbade me, but I paid no heed. Divine command theory, right? Anyone can apprehend the property of wrongness sticking plainly to the whole affair. Intuitionist ethics. Decent men remark it and are moved to tears. That's an interesting one. I'm not sure which ethic he has in mind there, but it's certainly one that people might bring up. And so he says, this is kind of taking the wrong approach to a case like this. We have all sorts of answers that are given by moral theories, right? That are trying to provide these answers about what's wrong with deceiving, killing, cooking the stranger, but none of them seem to land the way that they should. And so he's going to suggest an interesting recourse. He says, in this case, if we're going to call a halt somewhere in some sort of principle, why couldn't we call it early? Why couldn't we stop this process and, look at it as being evident or obvious or axiomatic or indemonstrable or intrinsic or whatever we want to call it? We would say there are clear cases of moral goodness, badness, obligation, or wrong which no theory can cloud and which men are prepared to fight to the last ditch. These are what he's going to call clear cases. And we'll explore that idea a little bit more elsewhere. What does he say about this here? So imagine you're in the scenario again. Somebody says, what was wrong with baking the obliging stranger? And all I can do is point to the circumstances comprising the act. Well, I put the fellow in an oven, you see. The oven was on, don't you know? And if my questioner persists saying, yeah, I know about all that, but what I want to know is why is that wrong? Gass says, I would recognize there's no use in replying that it's wrong because of the kind of act it is a wrong one, because my questioner is suffering from a sort of folie de doute morale, that's a madness of moral doubt, which forbids him to accept any final answer this early in the game, though he's going to have to accept an answer sooner or later down the line, right? And he says, maybe there's some advantage in postponing the stop, and this advantage would lie in the explanatory power of the higher level answer, what ethics is supplying us. It can't be that baking the stranger is wrong for no reason whatsoever. But what is that reason then? And he says, the moralist reasons for condemning my baking are, ludicrous. Now, he doesn't mean ludicrous as we just simply dismiss them. He means it in the classic sense of the term. There's something funny about them, something odd, something humorous, something playful about it. He says they sound queerly unfamiliar and out of place. Why? They intrude where one expects to find denunciation only. You should say, that's wrong, right? And you shouldn't be saying, well, what makes it wrong? Who are we to say that? Let's see if we can think it out. And he says that strangeness is due to the humor in them, and that's where we get these, things like, my act produced more pain than pleasure. If somebody were to say that, you'd be like, I think you kind of lost the point. And here's why. He says, I would say my act was wrong even if my stranger were tickled into laughter while he cooked, or if his baking did the utmost good it could, or in spite of it all I could consistently will whatever maxim I might have had became a universal law, or even if God spoke from a bush to me, thou shalt. How redundant the property of wrongness, as if one needed that in such a case. And would the act be right if the whole world howled its glee? And he says, moralists can say with conviction that the act is wrong, but none of them can successfully show it, which doesn't mean that they can't claim to show it. They can give us an argument. They can give us a line of reasoning, but that's not what actually makes the act wrong. And so there's something a bit weird about how they play with this. And so he says these are examples of clear cases in our ethical life, and we should maybe think a little bit more deeply about that.